We're happy to have with us Andy Hupp. He's the Certification Program Manager for the Ohio Ecological Food and Farming Association, or OEFFA. If you're in this region, it's a fabulous resource, and they put on an amazing conference themselves, so you should really take part in that group. This topic is one it's an annual feature at the conference, and we know it never draws hundreds of people, but the people who come can really benefit from the information. Becoming certified organic can be bewildering and confusing, and Andy's an expert at getting you going and getting you down that path. Once you do it a few years, it'll be old hat. But we'll leave it to Andy to explain the process and how to become certified organic. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Andy Hupp. I currently manage the certification program at OEFFA. I've worked there for a little over 10 years doing various things in certification most of that time. I also have a small vegetable farm just outside of Columbus here for my free time. So I'm gonna walk through today the National Organic Program and how OEFFA and other certifiers plug into that. I'll talk about the certification process. I'll briefly review the standards. That's not something that I can do thoroughly in an hour, but certainly can answer some questions for you if you have specific questions about standards, how they affect your operations. If there's time, I'll talk a little bit about input review. I know that's a thing that makes a lot of farmers really nervous about what things they're going to use to transition and be certified organic. And then briefly review some challenges, costs, and benefits of certification. And then we'll have some time for questions here, hopefully. And then also I've got an hour down the hall here after this where I can answer more individualized questions if you've still got them. So the word organic was protected in the federal law starting in 1990 by the Organic Foods Production Act. So that's the law that Congress passed that's behind the organic standards. The law says this is what the standards have to say, and then the standards go into the details. So the National Organic Program is the part of USDA that actually writes those standards and then makes sure that there are folks out there like OEFFA to enforce them. They're part of the Agriculture Marketing Service. So, it is a marketing program. It's a labeling program. This seal is the seal that goes on USDA organic products. And it's a labeling program that assures consumers that the products they're buying with the seal on it meet the standards. So the rules themselves, several kind of broad sections in there. Like I said, I'll go into a little bit more detail on this later in the talk here. They talk about inputs that are allowed and inputs that aren't allowed, protection of organic products from being mixed with non-organic products or being contaminated with things that aren't allowed for use in organic, natural resources, the practices that are required, processes that are required, labeling, since it is ultimately a labeling program, record keeping, accreditation, which is kind of like certification for certifiers. That's, we get inspected too, so there are some standards in there about that. And then compliance enforcement, what happens when things go wrong. So prior to 2002, now, just a minute ago I said 1990 was the date. That's when the law was written. It actually took 12 years to get that first set of standards written after USDA had their direction to go out and write standards. So prior to 2002, OEFFA and a lot of other organizations like us were certifying to our own organic standards. We wrote our own standards, we sent people out into the field, and then in Ohio at least, we had the blessing of the Ohio Department of Agriculture to say that you can certify operations as organic, they can use the word organic, and it's protected. So OEFFA and organizations like OEFFA helped form that original set of standards that was finally published in 2002 after quite the discussion over those 12 years. So since 2002, the USDA has overseen OEFFA and other certifiers in enforcing those standards. So the standards now are national and consistent and anywhere that USDA seal is being used. So certifiers like OEFFA come in a variety of forms. OEFFA is a nonprofit, but there are also for-profit certifiers. There are state and local agencies that get accredited to do certification. So that's one good thing to know about when you're looking to be certified is, what kind of organization are you working with? We get audited by the USDA, and it's a bit of a trick sometimes because obviously the mission of the organization is to serve organic farmers, sustainable farmers, but we're also a regulator. So with one hand we're saying we want to help you, and the other hand we're saying, but you can't do that thing that you really want to do. It makes the conversation pretty difficult at times, but I think it's just an important perspective to have on that. So for us, we're a regional certifier. We work in all of these states. We do have a few operations that we work with outside, few in New York, few in Wisconsin, but we generally try to stay within this region. We feel that we can do our best job of verifying organic integrity if we work in this defined region as opposed to all over the place. Currently, we certify about 1,250 operations in 16 states total. 90% of those are farms. The other 10% would be processors or handlers. Nearly half of the farmers that we work with are certified for livestock, so that is a big part of what we do. But we do have a pretty broad mix of operations that we work with. And currently we've got a staff of 19 and about 40 contract inspectors to do that work. So it does take a lot of people to verify those standards. So just getting started with what these would be called the 4 scopes of certification. It's kind of the types of things that can be certified. Crops, livestock, wild crops, that's your mushroom down there, and then processed products. And processed products is kind of the widest category. That can be anything from pasta factory to coffee roasting to feed mills to breakfast cereal. It's kind of all over the board. The farmers have to have some place to sell their products, and then the facilities that handle those in one way or another go under that handling category. So kind of some broad organic principles. My guess is that if you're here at the Acres Conference, you're familiar with these things, but just briefly to talk about what's kind of behind the more detailed standards. So the first one that I put on here is that it's a systems approach. One thing that I like to point out to people, particularly those that aren't very familiar with it, is that people like to say when they're talking about organic, well, you don't use pesticides. That's kind of the defining thing for people a lot of the times. And I think there's a danger there in talking about it just as input substitution. That doesn't mean that if a conventional farmer comes to us, stops using pesticide, and tries to get certified, they're not going to be successful. There's a lot more to it than that. Continuous improvement, that is to say that things don't always go right, but we do our best to work with folks to get things back on the right track. Prevention rather than putting out fires. So you don't have those big tools in the toolbox like herbicides and things like that. So really have to be planning out ahead to keep the problems from happening in the first place. The focus on the ecosystem, it's connected to the natural resources standards. And then the final piece is that traceability and auditability. Now, this is the one that farmers often get nervous about. I think there are some good arguments for great record keeping. I think that once folks do it for a while and find a system that works for them, they find that it actually helps them with their business and do better in the future. And I don't think these record keeping requirements have to be onerous. The goal is to have the product at the end of the day be traceable through the system. That doesn't mean that there's only one specific way to keep records that would enable us to do that. So the general requirements for certification, of course, even though it isn't all about inputs, it is somewhat about inputs. So you've got to make sure that those are compliant with the organic standards. You've got to have plans in place to conserve the natural resources on the operation, protect the organic products from contamination and commingling or the mixing, the records, and then also deal with us when we ask questions. A lot of times it's just our job to ask questions, and so part of the responsibility of the operation wanting to be certified is to answer those questions, to stay in communication with us about what's going on. So as far as the process itself goes, we talk about it really in 5 steps. There are 5 steps to getting certified. And I'll kind of go through these one by one. So the first piece is to complete what's called an organic system plan. You might think of this as your application for certification. It's going to describe the physical aspects of the operation, let's say the number of acres, the number of animals, the size of the buildings, the equipment that's used, things like that. What management practices are going to be used, how you're going to monitor that, the documentation that you're going to keep, and your list of inputs. So all of that goes into some paperwork. We provide forms that kind of provide a structure and prompt you to answer all the questions that we need to know to evaluate whether you can meet the standards or not. And then the next step is having somebody in our office take a look at that OSP. So we're going to look through all those answers, all those additional documents that you've provided describing what your plan is for your operation. You're not only going to tell us how you're going to get the work of production done, but really the point of the plan is to tell us how you're going to comply with the standards. So that's what the questions are guiding you towards. Our staff looks at this. They're making sure that it's complete, that you've answered all the questions, and they're making sure that the answers that you give are compliant with the standards. If there's anything that isn't complete or isn't clear to us, give a phone call or an email or send a letter asking some questions, trying to get an idea about what we're actually going to see when we come out to do the next step. And then we'll also flag items at this time to be seen by the inspector. This is a desk audit. This is somebody sitting in the office doing a desk audit. There's only so much that we can do. So we're going to ask some questions of the inspector to prepare them to give us the information we need to finish up the process. And then comes the on-site inspection. I think this is the part that a lot of folks will think about when they think of the certification process, is that on-site visit. So the inspector is really the eyes and the ears and sometimes the nose of the certification staff. They're going to go out and do that primary observation. They're going to do interview. They take a copy of that organic system plan with them, and they make sure that what's on that plan is what's actually out there in the real world. They're trying to make sure that that plan is being implemented on the farm that's trying to be certified. They'll also look at maybe some more documentation than we would in the office. For instance, in your organic system plan, we would ask that you provide a list of the seeds you plan to use for the year. So you might send that to us in March. You've got a pretty good idea of what seeds you're going to use at that point. If the inspector comes out in June, they're actually going to look at the tags or the packets and the receipts from all those seeds to make sure that what you planned is what actually happened. If not, we can make some updates, but also to make sure that those seeds themselves are compliant with the rules. So are they organic seeds? Do they have any treatments on them? All of those things. The inspector isn't there to make any decisions. The inspector's job is really to observe what they see and put that in a report for us. The standards are really set up to avoid potential conflicts of interest here. So at least 3 different people have to be involved in these 5 steps. And one of those things is that the inspector, once they inspect, can't make any decisions based on what happens at the inspection. They're going to write a summary of what they observed, and then somebody else is going to take that and decide what that means later on. As to inspection, there's always an annual inspection. Sometimes there are additional inspections if we had problems, or sometimes we also do unannounced inspections randomly or due to an ongoing problem. So at least 1 inspection a year. So after the inspector does their visit, should say at the end of that visit, they're going to do what's called an exit interview, which is supposed to be a summary of the inspection. So they're going to make a list of, these are the things that I've identified that might be problems later. So you should know when the inspector leaves the farm what they're going to take back and write in their report. They write that up. Again, our staff picks that up and takes a look. If anything was missing during the inspection or any issues were identified, they're going to follow up on those. Again, just communicating with you. They'll review all the documents for the year and make a summary, and then they make a recommendation at that point. If it's a first time an operation applies, they're gonna make that recommendation as either certify or deny certification. And then if the operation is currently certified, they're gonna say they should be renewed or we need to suspend or revoke them. So something's gone terribly wrong during the process, basically. So they make a recommendation at that point. And then the fifth step is the final decision. There's yet another person involved that is taking that recommendation, reviewing kind of the facts that recommendation is based on, and making that final decision whether to accept that recommendation or if some more work needs to be done. So this is when a certificate gets issued. Even though we talk about the 5 steps, I always try to make sure to put renewal in there. This is an annual process. The update of paperwork and the inspection are going to be every year. So really the cycle kind of goes on each year. This is just an example of what an organic certificate looks like from us. Certificates, once they're issued, it's kind of like on one hand, it's a license. It's a license to market your products as organic. It says, this is who you are, this is when you met the standards, and here are all the things that you've got that we have said meet the standards. On the other hand, though, maybe not as much as it used to be, as it's also a verification tool. This piece of paper gets passed around from farmer to farmer. If one farmer is selling seed or feed to another farmer, they'll pass this on with the purchase saying, I'm certified, here's a copy of my certificate, and the next farmer keeps that in their records. With electronic options, the NOP has created a database of organic operations. Some more of that verification is moving to the internet, but the certificate still plays an important role in there. So once the certificate is issued, it remains valid until the operation gives it up. That's what's called surrender. You decide not to be certified anymore, or something goes wrong and it ends up being suspended or revoked or something like that. So even though it has to be renewed annually, that doesn't mean it expires after a year. The process is continuous. And the certificate mostly contains the elements that you would expect. The name of the operation, the address, the products and services that are certified, the date the operation was first certified, the date this specific document was issued, and what's called an anniversary date, which is the date by which you have to submit a renewal the following year. So I just want to take one step back, maybe after walking through that process. I know sometimes that sounds, it feels a little threatening, it feels a little scary. I'm going to send this paperwork and $1,000 or whatever the price is off to the certifier, and then they're just going to decide whether I can be certified or not. We really see it as more of a partnership. There are several people involved in this process, and each person kind of has their role. So the producer, the farmer, has to be communicative, has to provide the plan, has to correspond. The inspector is going to go out and observe. The certifier, has some responsibilities here, and that we're responsible to uphold the standards, but also to treat you fairly and to do the due process. And of course, the consumer has a role in all of this as well, in that at some level they're pushing the standards to be what they want the standards to reflect what they want the products they buy to look like. So I guess all of that is to say, we don't see this as strictly we'll take in the paperwork and decide whether or not you be certified. Again, the mission of the organization is really to help farmers understand what the requirements are and what we need to get you there. So again, briefly, I'm not going to be able to go through all of the standards in great detail in an hour-long presentation, but just to give an overview, again, most of you are probably familiar with some of the basic requirements, but to get certified, an operation, the land must have 36 months, so 3 years, free of prohibited substances prior to the first organic crop being harvested. There have to be buffer zones that prevent adjoining land use, the neighbors spraying, for instance, from contaminating the organic crops. There are some restrictions around manure use for crops that are for human consumption, trying to keep food safety in there, and also to seek out and use organic seed if it's available. Another piece that we actually get a lot of questions on is crop rotation. There are kind of two parts to the crop rotation rules. One part says you can't plant the same crop in the same place twice in a row. You know, that seems pretty self-evident. The other part of the standard talks more about the functions of the crop rotation. So that talks about maintaining or improving the soil organic matter, pest management, nutrient management, and erosion control. So when we look at a crop rotation, we're actually going beyond just, a good example might be if an operation comes to us and their plan says, we're just going to alternate between corn and beans each year. Now, that meets the first part up there. It doesn't mean that immediately does qualify or doesn't qualify. What we need to do is have a deeper conversation about does that really take care of weed management? You know, without a small grain in there or a hay crop, are you going to be looking at a lot of weeds, potential weed problems, or if you're going back to the same crop family every other year, are you increasing the potential for pest and disease problems? So that's where we get into those more detailed conversations. And in this pest, weed, and disease management, I think the most important thing to talk about here is, of course, there are some allowed pesticides and organics if they are made from non-synthetic natural substances. But that doesn't mean that they can be used quite the same way pesticides can be used in conventional production. The standards require that you have the crop rotation and that you have other cultural and mechanical practices in place before using those substances. Here are a few examples, selecting varieties, keeping the fields clean, encouraging beneficials, mulching, mowing, all of those kinds of things. So this is going to be different on each operation, and that's where it's really on us to make sure that each operation we work with is employing the things that make sense for their operation. If they still have problems, they can then go to the toolbox and use those approved substances, but we really need to make sure that these management practices are in place first. So for livestock, the first thing we start with is where do the animals come from that are going to be certified? In general, the requirement is that an animal that's going to be organic is organic from the last third of gestation. So organic management starts before birth. There are a few exceptions here. Poultry has to be managed organically from the second day of life, so the hatchery doesn't have to be certified. And a dairy herd can be converted over a period of a year of organic management. So there is an exception there for milk production anyway. Those animals could never be slaughtered as organic, but there is an exception there. As far as feed goes, all organic animals have to be on organic feed all the time. I think that kind of speaks for itself. There are also some specific prohibitions about things that aren't allowed to be in the feed. As far as actually managing the livestock, when we talk about healthcare, we talk about it much in the same way that we talk about pest and weed management, like I just mentioned. There are still some tools in the toolbox, but you can't go to those until you've really put the management practices in place. Physical alterations are allowed that have to be done in a way that minimizes pain and stress as far as animal welfare goes. And then there's a kind of a specific list of prohibitions. Antibiotics, drugs can't be used when animals aren't sick, hormones. There are a few allowed parasiticides, but they can only be used in the case of an emergency. And also an important thing to note in terms of animal welfare is there is some incentive when an animal gets sick not to treat it, to maintain its organic status, but the standards actually require that if an animal's sick and it can't be treated through organic means, then you've got to do what you've got to do, give it antibiotics, whatever is necessary, and then that animal loses its organic status. Living conditions are also something we look at pretty closely when we're out on a farm. They need to accommodate the health and natural behavior of the animal. That's pretty variable for different species and even different breeds. So we're looking at that and working with farmers to make sure that we know what's appropriate for their animals. All animals have to have year-round access to the outdoors, exercise areas, direct sunlight, shade, fresh air, clean water. This is just basically a list of things that healthy animals need, and I think most livestock farmers are well aware of that. Also, the housing has to be suitable to the species, the stage of life, and the climate of the area where you're at. Of course, there are some exceptions for temporary confinement. If an animal's giving birth, if there's an ice storm, there's a short list of reasons that animals can be confined for their health and well-being, basically. As far as ruminants go, there are some additional criteria that we verify as far as their feed. So ruminants have to get at least 30% of their dry matter intake from pasture during the grazing season. There are some stipulations about how long the grazing season has to be, at least 120 days and appropriate to the region. And then pasture management must follow the crop standards. So pasture is treated as any other crop. As far as handling goes, we do talk a lot about labeling when we work with handlers. Again, it's a labeling program at the end of the day. But we also look at the full composition of ingredients in the product, talk about pest management in their facilities, and then also how they prevent mixing. If the facility handles both organic and conventional products, how do they prevent those from mixing if they're using common equipment and things like that. Check the time here. I'll take a little bit of time to talk about inputs. So the very basic standards around inputs are these two, the second and third bullet point here. The wording in the rule is a little funny. It says non-synthetic substances are allowed and non-synthetic substances are allowed and synthetic substances are prohibited. What that means is anything that's natural can be used unless it's on a list. The things on that list are things like arsenic, things that are clearly toxic. They're natural, but not wise to use. And synthetic substances, so anything that has chemically changed from its natural form, isn't allowed unless it's specifically on a list. So there are a list of exceptions to that. Overall in organic, there are three things that are prohibited, and that's what we call the big three. GMOs, ionizing radiation, and sewage sludge. So we verify those for all inputs that go into organic products. So I just mentioned that there were a couple of lists in the rule, and those are the allowed synthetic substances and the prohibited natural substances. So I want to talk about how those lists get made, basically. There's a federal advisory board called the National Organic Standards Board. They advise the National Organic Program on changes to the standards and what should go on those lists. So the public or industry can petition substances to be put on there, and then each substance is automatically reviewed every 5 years. The board uses these criteria to decide whether or not a substance can be on that list. So it's not just a matter of, Well, somebody wanted to use it, so we put it on there. They actually look at them, that there isn't a natural alternative, that there aren't adverse environmental or health effects, and that it is essential for organic production and handling. There are several organizations out there that specifically do input review for organic operations. Probably the most well-known one is OMRI, the Organic Materials Review Institute. I saw them up in the exhibit hall earlier. So they don't certify a farm or a handler. They certify that products that farms or handlers want to use are allowed. They work just with the manufacturers of the inputs. So if you see the OMRI seal on a product, that's a widely recognized and respected body that does those reviews, and you can be sure that that product is allowed for the use that they approved it for. A few others, Washington State Department of Agriculture, US EPA has a for organic production seal, and most recently the California Department of Food and Agriculture is also putting out a seal. So if you see any of these seals on a product, you'll still need to make sure you're looking carefully about what it's approved for. Just because it's approved as a fertilizer doesn't mean that you can feed it to your cows. But these are reputable organizations that certifiers broadly recognize as doing those review. And then we as a certifier also do some of these. So if not all products end up being listed with one of these four, so we actually dig in and look at the ingredients, and I'll go through that a little bit more. So our responsibility on this front is to verify that every single input used by every single certified operation is compliant with the standards. So we look through those organic system plans, we see the list of inputs, we go through them one by one and make sure that every single one is listed by one of those other agencies, or that we do our own work to verify that it's compliant. So at this point, we've been doing this, the input review for maybe the last 8 years or so. We've got a list of about 5,000 products that we maintain. As far as, some are allowed, some are not allowed, but we've got ingredient information on all of those. And then we have to prove to our inspector that we've gone through and done that work. So the way we do that is we contact the manufacturer, or in some cases, a distributor who's selling the product directly to the farmer. We're going to collect a label, a complete list of ingredients, and sometimes we need more information about some of those ingredients. So for instance, there are plenty of substances out there in the world that could be made from a natural source or could be synthesized in a factory. So we have to differentiate between which source we're talking about, and that will make the difference about whether or not it's allowed. So that's where we get some additional backup. Or in some cases, we might need to ask for a non-GMO statement, because we have to verify that for things that might be from GMO sources. And we have to treat inputs as if they're guilty until they're proven innocent. Every time an input comes into us, it's not allowed until we have done this work and verified that it's compliant with the standards. The farmer or the handler or whoever we're working with also has some responsibility here. The most important thing, and I think this goes beyond inputs, is just list everything that you're going to use or do in that organic system plan. We're reasonable folks. We definitely know that plans change. We know that when you're filling out paperwork in January, doesn't mean that's what's actually going to happen in July. But do everything you can to summarize what you're going to do in that plan. That leaves the least guesswork to come up later. If you're going to put an input on the list, make sure it's already approved before you use it. Make sure that the inputs are approved for the specific use that you're going to use them. Sometimes an input will have a restriction that goes along with it. So it's allowed, but it's only allowed under certain circumstances. So make sure that you've got those circumstances and that you've got those circumstances documented before you go out and use a restricted input. Recording when inputs are used, what the product, what's the field, which animal was it used with, and the date it was used. That's something that the inspector is going to look at. And then make all those records and labels and everything available for your inspector. So save receipts, save labels, that makes things go a lot easier at inspection. Things go wrong. When something goes wrong, that doesn't mean that it's catastrophic every time, but things go wrong, and that's normal. That's not just within inputs, but that's within the entire certification process. I'm not going to go into any detail on this. This is just put up here, basically to say, stay away from all of this. This is the process that we have to go through when things do go wrong. Non-compliances are what we call when something, when we find that an operation has done something that doesn't line up with the rules. That's common. That happens fairly regularly, that we find something small that an operation hasn't done correctly. We're required by the standards to notify them that they've done something not right, but usually all that means is that the operation has to come back to us and say, I understand, this is how I'm going to do things differently in the future, and they present us with a new plan that does comply with the standards. Things go really sideways when we don't get that response, or that response doesn't adequately address the problem, or in a few cases, something's been done that can't be corrected. A good example there would be applying a conventional fertilizer to a field. A farmer submitting a plan, there's no plan that can take that fertilizer back. So there are some actions that have significant consequences, but for the most part, we can work through issues with people. The only other thing worth saying about the process is that there are a lot of rights for certified operations on this chart. In several places, there are opportunities to rebut, opportunities to come back and say, you made a mistake, certifier. There are opportunities to appeal to the National Organic Program, or even beyond that, into kind of the administrative courts within USDA. So even when things go really wrong, operations still have, they still have options to have that issue considered by other people if they disagree with the way it's gone. Talk just a little bit about the costs of certification. There are some direct costs, obviously. There is an annual fee that we use to pay our staff and for a building and for our inspectors to come see you and for training. Right now, that's depending on where you live, right around $1,000 for the farm, with additional fees for livestock or handling, depending on what kind of operation. If you're in states where we don't work or looking at other certifiers, prices and fee structures vary a lot between certifiers. So just pay close attention to what you sign up for. Currently, there is cost share available through the Farm Bill, 75% up to $750. It seems like that one, every time the Farm Bill comes up, is under threat of being removed, but it's available right now. Another direct cost might be inputs. Organic inputs sometimes are more expensive than conventional inputs, depending on what you're doing. Additional infrastructure may be needed to comply with organic standards. That particularly might be the case for some livestock operations. And then obviously the transition period can be an expensive one for a farmer growing with organic methods for 3 years but not getting the organic premium price. Some indirect costs of certification. There is some time involved with maintaining certification, so filling out the OSP, taking time out with the inspector, and corresponding with the certifier, and then also the record keeping. And I mentioned earlier that I think that a lot of farmers end up really finding that that's worth it in the long run, but there is some time, especially up front, setting up the systems you need to organize your receipts, document what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And then labor. Organic farming is, in general, more labor intensive than conventional farming. So there may be some cost there too. Some challenges that organic farmers often talk about are that 3-year transition period. Getting in the door can be costly and can be difficult. Just farming, just farming with fewer tools than another farmer might have that doesn't have to deal with us coming in and asking questions. And then maintaining certification can also be a challenge, depending on what you're doing. There are some benefits too. The most obvious one to most folks are the prices for organic. People come to organic for different reasons, but I don't think anyone's upset when they get a better price for their product at the end of the day. We do hear a lot of folks talk about their personal health or family health. A lot of inspections I've been on, I do my best to ask folks what brings them to organic, and a lot of times it's a grandparent or something sprayed and they got sick. One day they got sprayed or they got cancer over a period of time and they attribute it to that. So there are some reasons in that. We also have folks that come to it because they're conservation minded in the first place. Folks that have been farming this way for a long time and like that there's a program out there that recognizes their conservation efforts. I'll make an argument that the records and the traceability is an advantage. I don't think anybody believes me on that one, at first at least, but I'll make that argument. And then also just the overall resilience and sustainability of a farm operation that's more diverse, generally tends to be more drought tolerant, more stress tolerant than operations that are more input intensive, we'll say. As far as some resources for you, OEFFA's website certainly has some information. I would say that our best resource, though, is our staff. So we've got our certification staff who are always more than happy to help with questions about the standards. We also have some technical staff that are charged with education, effectively organic farmer or transitional farmer helplines, where if you contact them, they can answer your production questions related to organic in a way that maybe the certification staff wouldn't be able to. We also provide what we call audit trail documents. Basically, those are record-keeping templates. Since we hear a lot from folks that they have trouble setting up record-keeping systems that work for them and give the inspector what they need, we set up just some basic worksheets that we can provide to people. We don't require them, but it does allow folks a way to understand the kind of information that an inspector looks for and a format that might work for them to keep track of that stuff. The National Organic Program also actually has some pretty good resources. Obviously, you'll need to know the standards for your type of operation. They have a list of certifiers. They've also got some fact sheets and basic guides for folks getting started. I've got some time for questions here. I've also got a room down the hall here from 3 to 4. So if you don't have questions now and something comes up or have more specific questions about your individual operation and want to chat, I'll be parked down there for a while. My contact information's here at the top. We have a materials review staff person who just looks at those inputs. So that's the person to contact if you want to know if something's allowed or not. And then Eric is just our OEFFA Sustainable Agriculture Educator. He's basically that organic farmer helpline that I mentioned, where he's really got kind of the broad view, has done organic inspections and production, and his effectively his whole job is to sit there and answer questions for folks and do the research when you don't know how to go forward. Anybody have any questions? Yeah, sure. Sure, so the question was, how invasive is the inspection process? I'll say that the usual length of an annual inspection is a half day, we'll say, for a small to medium-sized farm. It's annual. There may be some correspondence in advance of that, but usually the goal of that correspondence in advance of that is to get you set up so that the inspection moves more efficiently, so it doesn't take up more time. But usually it kind of goes as follows. The inspector will sit down with that organic system plan, walk through it step by step, making sure that what's happening on the farm is what's in the plan. So there's the paperwork portion, I guess we'll say. There's a tour of the operation. So the length of the inspection can greatly depend on not only the size, but arrangement. For a farmer that's got 20 different fields spread over 4 different counties, there's going to be a lot of truck time in there. But we're going to go look at every facility, every field, all the equipment, all the handling, anything that's going on at the operation. And then there's the record review. So looking at the records that have been kept on a regular basis, and there's an audit portion to that. So auditing each operation for traceability to make sure that product that leaves the farm can be traced back to the field or animal or wherever it came from, and for mass balance, which is basically to say, make sure people aren't cheating, that the operation didn't sell more organic product than it should have been able to produce on the acreage or number of animals that we're looking at. So it varies by operation, depends on what the operation's doing and how many problems are found. The more problems that are found, the longer it takes to work through those and clearly identify them. But I think a half day is a pretty safe assumption. Sure. Right, so what needs to be done during the transition period? Basically, the only requirement during that period is that you don't use prohibited substances. So in that, right, so that there isn't a specific record-keeping requirement during the transition period, but when your first inspector comes out, you're going to have to prove to them that you didn't use those prohibited substances. And one good way to do that is by having a pretty good record of what you did use. So if you can show. Sure. I mean, it's a reasonable question. There are some things that we're trained to do just as far as observation of weed patterns and things like that. You can see how long a field might have been managed with cultivation rather than herbicides, things like that. But records are certainly the best way to do it, to be able to have some documentation of what you have been doing there. But in some cases, a farmer will bring on a field that they haven't managed for the last 3 years, and in that case, we would accept an affidavit that's signed by the previous manager describing what they've done on that field for the last 3 years. Yeah, it is just fine to certify only part of an operation. It's pretty common for folks to dabble a little bit to see, to see if it works for them, and it's certainly fine. Now, the caveat there is that there's a little bit more work to do when an operation is split. Particularly if there's shared equipment, there's going to be clean out between use with the conventional and the organic. There's going to have to be records of those clean outs. So there's a little bit more record keeping that goes along with an operation that does both, but certainly possible. Sure. So you'd have to be making sure that you've got good buffers between the organic and non-organic portions, or the portion that's in transition and the part that you're managing as conventional. But if it's in hay or cover crop for that period of 3 years, there wouldn't be a whole lot to do during that period. Sure. So, but the pasture rotation standards do acknowledge that there are perennial systems even beyond pasture. So we would still be looking at those maintenance of soil, organic matter, weed, pest, disease control. If you're doing rotational grazing, doing some clipping afterwards, things like that to keep weeds from going to seed. But you would not have to plow those fields is the basic answer to the question, I think. Sure. Right. So the transition period doesn't have to be monitored by a certifier. So if an operation comes to us and can show that they have managed their operation organically for 3 years or without prohibited substances, they would qualify for certification immediately. So that is all it would take, I think. Yeah. It's a really good question. So the question is whether, if on rented ground, whether the owner needs to be certified or the renter needs to be certified. And the quick answer is that it's the manager, whoever's managing the land. So it's easy to think about the certificate being for a person or a piece of ground or an animal or something like that. But it's really, what we're really certifying is that management plan. So that individual person or company or group of people or whatever are applying for certification to manage a farm in a certain way. And that whole package is what gets certified. So even if you're farming and you decide you don't want to farm anymore, but somebody that worked for you wants to get certified, they don't just jump on that same certificate. They have to start over. They're a new manager. Their management may look very similar to what you had always done, but it's a new person, it's a new business. So it's a new plan, and that leads to a new certificate. Right, so the question is weed mat allowable. So they're on that list of allowed synthetic substances. Plastic mulch is allowed as long as it's not made from PVC, and I haven't customarily found any that is. The restriction that comes along with that material, though, is that it has to be removed at the end of the growing or harvest season. So for annual crops, that means every fall you've got to pull plastic. You can't till the plastic in, you can't leave it sit out there over winter and it kind of breaks up and then it's hard to pull out. It has to be taken away and disposed of every year. For perennial crops, we know that the harvest season could be many years in the case of a crop like yours. So what we're really doing in that case then is just monitoring that it's not breaking down. If we're seeing that it's starting to shred up and starting to leave pieces of plastic in the ground, then we're going to ask you for a plan to take care of that, being pulled and replaced or however you're going to do that. But plastic mulch in general is allowed, or landscape fabric. Sure. Right. So the buffer zones, the way the standards read are that they have to be adequate to prevent contamination from the neighboring land use. So the language in the standards is really squishy, which on one hand is great, and on the other hand is really frustrating because everybody's just give me a number. What's the number? I can't go out and measure adequate. So we say a rule of thumb is 25 or 30 feet. In general, most spray equipment, if being used properly and under the proper conditions, the drift isn't going to be any further than that. If you're next to an orchard, you might have a different story where they're kind of spraying straight up in the air, or we've heard a lot about the dicamba lately, volatilizing and moving a lot farther than 25 or 30 feet. So there are a lot of considerations there. We will look at how is the neighboring land being managed. Is there a 30-mile-an-hour wind that comes across constantly? Is it straight uphill? All of those things might make a buffer bigger. But in general, flat ground, row crops side by side, usually a 30-foot buffer we would say is adequate, as long as there's some monitoring going on there too, keeping an eye on the neighbor when they're spraying, that they're being responsible. Anybody else? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The answer is very similar to what I was answering this gentleman, that it's fine to do, but it does create some additional headaches. If you run the combine, 2 strips around the outside. Exactly. Then the combine has to be cleaned out and generally do what we call a product purge. So running some crop that's inside the buffer through that combine and disposing of it with that buffer crop, because you can't really get in and clean out a combine that well. But with all of those records showing that you've done that, yeah, that's just fine. And pretty common for folks with big fields, make a single run down to the elevator and get a little bit of cash for that area too. But people use their buffers in a lot of different ways. Some are just natural resource conservation areas. Some folks will graze their horses around the edges, just whatever makes sense for your operation. Sure. Right, so the question is, would conventional manure potentially give you problems? No, mostly, but we still ask farmers to do some verification on conventional manure. We treat manure as manure. It's a natural substance. We don't look into what the animal ate. But we have certainly seen situations where big farms with big manure piles will put in fly bait granules or something like that. That's something that is meant to continue on in the manure, and that we would consider a prohibited substance application. So as long as the farmer is working with the source and verifying that there's nothing being added to it, we would accept the manure as manure and allow. Mm-hmm. Yeah, medicated feed, we actually have had this issue before where medicated feed was basically being dumped on the ground. And in that case, we did take the area where feeding was happening out of certification. Not if the feed is passing through the animal and then being deposited as manure. Only if the feed itself is being thrown on the ground with the medication in it. All right, well, I think we're getting close here on time anyway. Like I said, I'll be down the hall for the next hour, so if folks still have questions, come down and find me. Thanks very much.